The clock on the living room wall read 3:12 a.m. The dim light from the crystal lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the expensive furniture and the paintings on the walls. In the oppressive silence of the house, only the sound of a cigarette burning slowly in the ashtray broke the stillness. David looked at the office door where his wife, Natalie, slept deeply, unaware of what was about to happen. Her breath was soft, steady, almost peaceful, but David felt nothing of the sort. He was at war with himself, his fingers sweaty around the cigarette, and his stomach twisted in a tight knot. He didn't know what else to do. The marriage from the start had been a business arrangement, a facade, a paper lie that concealed who he truly was. And Natalie, with her blue eyes and perfect smile, had never known. She fell in love with the idea of a successful man, but never with the real man, the man who felt trapped between two identities, a prisoner of his own life. That was how he'd ended up here, at this moment, with the final solution. A simple solution, he thought, almost laughing to himself, but the tension in the air kept him from making any sound. On the other side of the house, in a room equally dark, Jake was in a similarly grim scenario. His wife, Lisa, lay with her back turned, unaware that her husband was also at war with himself. He stared at the revolver on the knit-stand. The idea seemed absurd yet inevitable. They had already planned everything: the murder, the escape, the freedom. The two men had been accomplices without even looking directly at each other. They knew what the other wanted. They knew what they had to do. And everything had been meticulously planned, like the precision of a Swiss watch, until that night when the tension would finally explode. A coincidence that wasn't a coincidence. A story that repeated itself in the shadows, unseen, unheard, but always present. David and Jake had reached a point of no return. The pact was made, and with the first move, their lives would change forever. The silence broken by the fury of action would be the only thing left to tell the story. But at the same time as the decision seemed clear, a doubt hung in the air, like a black cloud about to release its rain. Would it be that easy? Would the plan have no flaws? And more importantly, would it be possible to escape the consequences of a perfect crime? The fate of the two women was sealed, but the complications had not even begun. The night passed like a specter, unnoticed, unfelt. When the sun finally began to rise on the horizon, tinging the sky with a faint orange, David sat on the couch, his hands over his face, the cigarette now almost burned out. The silence, heavier than ever, enveloped the house. The air was cold, but not enough to ease the suffocating feeling surrounding him. The plan that had seemed so clear, so precise, now appeared to be a tightrope about to snap. Natalie was still sleeping when David got up. He had looked at her once more, the woman he had promised to protect, the woman he had promised to love, but who had no idea of the abyss separating them. He had convinced himself there was no other way, but now, in the full light of day, the doubts started to creep in. He felt weaker than ever. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Jake was in the car, parked in front of a diner called the Rusty Spoon. The smell of strong coffee and fried food wafted through the air, but it wasn't that which kept him there, motionless. He was waiting for the right moment. The revolver was still in his bag, under the seat, so close yet so far. Lisa was still at home, sleeping with the confidence of someone who had never known the shadows in which her husband hid. The tension was starting to take shape. Every minute felt like an eternity, as if time had slowed down, waiting for something to happen. It was as if the universe had paused, the distant sounds of the city traffic muffled by the rising pressure in Jake's chest. He looked at the empty street. Cars passed at high speed, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. He knew what he had to do, but fear paralyzed him, as if, in some way, he still expected reality to change. David and Jake didn't speak directly to each other, but they understood each other perfectly. They were in the same boat, in the same storm. The connection between them was silent, almost palpable, like an invisible thread linking them in the darkness. But what they didn't know was that behind their certainties the plan was starting to fall apart. At the moment when David was about to do what he knew had to be done, he heard a sound coming from the kitchen. A faint noise, but enough to make his heart race. He knew it was Natalie. He knew the clock was running out, but now the doubt was consuming him with an unexpected force. She was waking up. He crept slowly to the bedroom door, quietly, his sweat dripping down his forehead. Inside he felt a struggle between the desire to break free and the regret of his choice. He couldn't turn back anymore. He couldn't change what had already been done. Murder was the only way out, but he asked himself, almost in a whisper to himself, "Will this really set me free?" Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Jake was beginning to realize that what had seemed like a clear and obstacle-free path was, in fact, filled with flaws. He thought of Lisa's expression when she woke up, the shock and horror when she saw what he was about to do. But what then? What would happen after? Both men were bound by a wrong idea of freedom, and deep down they knew that nothing would be as they imagined. The plan was unraveling. The steps they had taken toward the crime now seemed like steps into a trap, but the worst was yet to come. What seemed like the solution to everything was about to turn into an endless complication, and they could hardly imagine how their own prison was about to tighten. The truth they had avoided for so long, was beginning to reveal itself, and the price of freedom would be much higher than either of them could pay. David hesitated as he reached the bedroom door. He knew there was no more time. The plan was already in motion, and deep down he knew that the worst thing that could happen now was to fail. So close to freedom. The idea of being discovered, of living an empty life of lies, of hiding again, was unbearable. He looked at the door, listening to Natalie's soft breathing from the other side, unaware of the storm approaching. With a deep breath he turned the door knob and entered the room, moving with the precision of a man who had no more room for doubt. The soft, diffused light of the day filtered through the curtains, illuminating Natalie's face as she slept, her golden hair spread across the pillow. He felt a pang of pain as he looked at her, but the conviction of his decision was stronger. She would never know the truth, and he couldn't allow her to. David approached the bed and stopped, observing her in a moment that seemed to last forever. Then, with almost mechanical movement, he took the pillow and pressed it against Natalie's face. The sound of her breath stopping, the involuntary struggle of her body, the faint movement of her hands trying to push the pillow away, all happened in a flash. But when her body stopped moving, the silence that followed was deeper than anything he had ever experienced. He stood there for a few seconds, frozen. He didn't know if he felt relief, if he felt guilty, or if his body simply no longer reacted. When he finally removed the pillow and looked at his wife's face, her eyes were closed, and all that remained of her was the stillness. David left the room with the same coldness with which he entered, feeling the weight of what he had just done settling in his chest, yet still unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. He didn't look back. He knew this was the end of everything. However, before leaving the house, he looked at the phone in his hand, hesitating. Something felt off. A sense of unease, as if something wasn't right. He took one last look at the empty house, at the life he had built on lies and secrets, and stepped out toward the car. But somewhere something was still chasing him. He didn't know what. Jake, on the other hand, wasn't in a much different place. The revolver in his bag still weighed on him, and the pressure to make a decision seemed to grow with every passing second. He finally started the car and drove back home. The feeling of anticipation was almost physical, the knot in his stomach tightening with every mile. But when he arrived home, he realized that Lisa hadn't woken up yet. He parked, sat there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. The house felt strange, as if the very structure was holding its breath, waiting for the decision he would make. The front door was slightly ajar, and a cool breeze was flowing through the crack. Jake entered slowly, the morning shadows still stretching through the silent house. He could hear the faint sound of a soft rustling coming from upstairs. Lisa was waking up, but something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew, or at least suspected. He never imagined he would reach this point, but he knew there was no turning back. He slowly climbed the stairs, his body tense, his heart pounding. When he reached the top, he saw Lisa, still lying there, but now with her eyes slightly open, as if she had been waiting for something he still couldn't understand. Fear was written on her face, and it was then, at that moment, that Jake realized something crucial. He had underestimated the extent of his own lie. She no longer trusted him, and the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. He looked at the revolver on the knit-stand, and for a moment doubt returned. He didn't know what to do. The thought of being caught, of being seen as a criminal, a traitor, seemed unbearable. But at the same time, the sight of Lisa with that look of distrust burned inside him. The choice was in front of him. But he knew nothing would be simple anymore. There was no more innocence, no more clear plan. Their fate was tied to the decisions they made, and the steps they would take from here could not be undone. As the clock continued ticking, both David and Jake found themselves at a dead end. Freedom was within their grasp, but with it came a price, a high price, full of shadows and complications, one that neither of them could fully understand just yet. The air was heavy that morning, as if the entire world was about to collapse. David drove through the city streets, the headlights of the car cutting through the early morning mist with a distant glow. But what weighed on his mind wasn't the emptiness of the road or the hum of the engine. It was the weight of what he had done. The murder of Natalie still haunted him, a vivid memory of how he had been capable of extinguishing the life he once thought was the only one he had. But the lie was now exposed, and there was no turning back. Unlike David, Jake couldn't leave the house. Revolt and panic were beginning to consume his body, but he couldn't give in. He had already taken an irreversible step, and now the abyss before him seemed larger than anything he had imagined. The sight of Lisa, her look of distrust, made his stomach churn, but the last thing he wanted was to face reality. However, he knew there was no escape. He was too entangled in this web of lies to walk away without paying a price. "You can't hide from me anymore," he murmured, almost like a silent mantra, a reminder that in the end there was nowhere to run. Then the phone rang. David stopped in the middle of the street, the cell phone screen flashing with a notification. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew it couldn't be good. The sound of the message came like thunder in his ears. When he looked at the screen, Jake's name glowed brightly, and he felt a chill run down his spine. What could he want? What did he know? What had he discovered? With trembling hands, David answered. Jake's voice, muffled and tense, came through on the other end. "David, we've got a problem. Lisa, she knows. She knows everything." Those words hit him like a sharp blade. He didn't have time to be shocked. Fear surged up his throat like poison, and his mind began to whirl, trying to process what that confession meant. He had killed Natalie, but what Jake was saying now was even worse. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. "Jake, what are you talking about? How does she know?" David asked, his voice hoarse. I don't know, but she knows. I saw the fear in her eyes. She looked at me like she knows everything. It happened this morning. I saw something I shouldn't have." She was holding her phone, and it wasn't just any message. She was getting something I don't know. "But she knows it was you. And now she's calling the police." Jake's words hung in the air like a distant echo. The idea that everything they had done together could be revealed was a vision David wasn't ready to face. He wanted to scream, he wanted to fight, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Their fate was sealed, and freedom, which had seemed so close, now felt distant, like a mirage fading away. "No, this can't be happening," David muttered, more to himself than to Jake. What could he do? He was already in the center of a storm, and there was no way to escape. If the police arrived, everything would be lost. Not just for him, but for Jake, too. What had started as a well-thought-out plan for freedom had turned into a nightmare beyond control. Jake was in a panic, his voice trembling. "David, I don't know what to do. I've got her here now, and she's saying she's going to tell everything. If you don't do something, it's all over." David could think no more. He was making impulsive decisions almost without feeling, as if he were simply reacting to the mounting pressure. He needed to do something, but his mind was in chaos. He had thought that Natalie's murder would be the key to freedom, but now everything was falling apart. He looked out at the street before him, the tall buildings, the empty roads. He didn't know where to go. That's when he heard the sound of a siren. The police were already on their way. Panic took hold of him. Adrenaline surged. There was no more time. He grabbed the steering wheel with more force, almost without thinking, and sped off, his mind racing with chaotic thoughts. He was running, but he knew that with every passing second, he was closer to being caught. Freedom, which he had imagined in his hands, was now behind him, a shadow about to fall over him. Jake, on the other hand, was trapped in his own prison. Lisa, now in a panic, demanded answers, threatening to tell the police. The house was silent, but the tension was palpable, like a knife suspended in the air. He tried to speak, to convince her, but nothing made sense anymore. He was on the verge of collapse, and he didn't know what his end would be. He didn't know what else to do. Night fell, But what had started as a hope for freedom now transformed into a race against time. The lies were crumbling. Reality was imposing itself in an unforgiving way, and the two men were about to pay a price neither of them had imagined possible. What they didn't know was that, in the end, neither they nor the women they had killed would be the biggest losers in this story. The truth was about to be revealed in ways David and Jake could never have predicted. The worst was yet to come. David sped up without thinking, the tires screeching as he pulled away from the city. The sound of the sirens grew distant, but the panic in his chest only intensified. The empty streets felt like a metaphor for the life he was desperately trying to escape. But with every turn, with every skyscraper left behind, the feeling that there was nowhere to go grew stronger. He veered off the usual route, turning onto increasingly isolated streets, the tall buildings giving way to run-down houses, the city lights fading into the distance. The feeling of being followed was almost physical, as if the streets themselves were turning against him. The car turned onto a dirt road, and he stopped, feeling the weight of his breath. The phone rang again, and this time David knew exactly who it was. He didn't want to answer, but Jake's voice seemed to scream in his head. He answered, almost unwillingly. "David," Jake's voice sounded trembling and desperate. I don't know what to do. Lisa, she's completely out of control. She called the cops, and now she's saying that she's going to turn me in. She knows everything, David. I can't hold the lie anymore." David gritted his teeth, feeling the pressure building. "You let her do this? You let her call the cops?" Anger was clear in his voice, but it wasn't just anger at Jake. It was anger at himself, too. He knew he played a part in this. He couldn't deceive himself anymore. That murder wasn't just of Natalie. It wasn't just the murder of a wife to hide what they were. It was a collective death, a death involving Jake, Lisa, Natalie, and even him. A lie that, once exposed, had destroyed everything. And now they were all on the edge of an abyss, with the past coming back to haunt them and the police closing in. "David, I don't know what to do," Jake continued, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "She threatened me, and the police, they're coming here. What are we going to do?" David could think no more. He was making impulsive decisions, almost without feeling, as if he were simply reacting to the mounting pressure. He needed to do something, but his mind was in chaos. He had thought that Natalie's murder would be the key to freedom, but now everything was falling apart. He looked out at the street before him, the tall buildings, the empty roads. He didn't know where to go. That's when he heard the sound of a siren. The police were already on their way. Panic took hold of him, adrenaline surged. There was no more time. He grabbed the steering wheel with more force, almost without thinking, and sped off, his mind racing with chaotic thoughts. He was running, but he knew that with every passing second he was closer to being caught. Freedom, which he had imagined in his hands, was now behind him, a shadow about to fall over him. Jake, on the other hand, was trapped in his own prison. Lisa, now in a panic, demanded answers, threatening to call the police. The house was silent, but the tension was palpable, like a knife hanging in the air. He tried to speak, to convince her, but nothing made sense anymore. He was on the brink of collapse, and he didn't know what his end would be. He didn't know what else to do. Night fell, But what had started as a hope for freedom now transformed into a race against time. The lies were crumbling. Reality was imposing itself in an unforgiving way, and the two men were about to pay a price neither of them had imagined possible. What they didn't know was that, in the end, neither they nor the women they had killed would be the biggest losers in this story. The truth was about to be revealed in ways David and Jake could never have predicted. The worst was yet to come. David's breathing was heavy as he stepped out of the car. His heart pounded in his chest. The weight of his decisions was suffocating. He had thought the worst was over when he killed Natalie, but now it felt like it was only just beginning. His feet moved almost mechanically, carrying him closer to Jake's house. His mind was a blur, but one thing was clear: there was no going back. The lie had unraveled, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. Jake's house was silent. The messy yard, the closed blinds on the windows, everything felt out of place, like a scene from a nightmare. David stood in front of the door, staring at the key in his hand. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. What was it? He didn't know. The sound of the sirens still echoed in the distance, but he could feel that it wasn't the police that were chasing him anymore. Not anymore. It was the truth. When he stepped inside, Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, his head low, his shoulders slumped. Lisa was nowhere to be seen, but David knew she was somewhere, waiting for the right moment to act. "Jake," David said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "what do we do now?" Jake looked up at him with hollow eyes. "I don't know. I never thought it would come to this. I never wanted to kill Lisa. David, I never wanted it to go this far." David didn't answer immediately. He knew exactly what Jake meant. He didn't want to kill Natalie either, but it had all gone too far, and now they were trapped in a web of lies, murders, and desperation. There was no going back. The choice to continue or give up was in their hands now, and any move they made could be fatal. "You knew this was going to happen one day," David finally said. "You knew the lie had an expiration date. There's no way out of this without paying the price, but we have to decide now. We're at a point of no return." Jake looked at him, guilt filling his eyes. I just wanted it to be different. For us to have more time, more freedom. I didn't know this freedom would come with such a high price." But before David could respond, a noise from upstairs froze both of them. The sound of soft footsteps, as if someone were trying not to be heard. A door creaked open. Lisa. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression cold and determined. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I know something's wrong here," she said, her voice low but laced with anger. "And you, David, you're not getting away with this. Neither you nor Jake. I'll do whatever it takes to end this. Now it's my turn." David felt his heart race. He knew the moment to escape had passed. Not anymore. Everything was crumbling around them, and whatever they did next would have irreversible consequences. The tension in Jake's house was palpable. Every word exchanged between the two men felt like it carried too much weight, as if the air itself was charged with electricity, ready to spark into an explosion. Lisa was there now, and her presence only amplified the chaos that had already consumed the two men. What once seemed like an attempt to escape, a search for freedom, now felt like an endless nightmare. David could feel his throat tighten, the weight of the situation suffocating him. He knew he had little time left. Lisa, for her part, was colder than he had imagined. When she walked into the kitchen, her eyes no longer shone with the fear he had seen before. They were dark, empty, as if the woman he once knew had been swallowed by something far more dangerous. The anger was no longer just a thirst for vengeance. It was an unstoppable force, ready to destroy everything she had built. "I'm not letting this slide," Lisa said, her voice low but sharp as glass. "Not even if I have to destroy everything to expose you to." David knew she wasn't just talking about exposing the murder anymore. What she was saying ran much deeper. Lisa knew about everything they were trying to hide. She knew about what had happened between him and Jake. She knew about the secrets they had buried. "Lisa, you don't know what you're saying," Jake said, desperately trying to calm himself. But David could see in Jake's eyes that he already knew there was no way out. They were at the bottom of the pit, with no chance of escape. "I do know, Jake, I know more than you think," Lisa replied with a cold smile. She had taken a step forward as if preparing for the final battle. "And you too. You're going to pay for everything you've done." David looked at Jake, who was beginning to realize that the situation had spiraled out of control. Everything they had planned was falling apart in front of them. The lies were no longer just a way to protect their own skins. Now, they were a prison, and that prison was about to collapse. "You knew this was going to happen one day," David finally said. "You knew the lie had an expiration date. There's no way out of this without paying the price, but we have to decide now. We're at a point of no return." Jake looked at him, guilt filling his eyes. I just wanted it to be different, for us to have more time, more freedom. I didn't know this freedom would come with such a high price." But before David could respond, a noise from upstairs froze both of them. The sound of soft footsteps, as if someone were trying not to be heard. A door creaked open. Lisa. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression cold and determined. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I know something's wrong here," she said, her voice low but laced with anger. "And you, David, you're not getting away with this. Neither you nor Jake. I'll do whatever it takes to end this. Now it's my turn." David felt his heart race. He knew the moment to escape had passed. Not anymore. Everything was crumbling around them, and whatever they did next would have irreversible consequences. Lisa didn't waste time acting. She knew the clock was ticking, but she also knew she now had the power to take control of the situation. While the two men stood there, lost, trying to deal with the truth they could no longer hide, she prepared to take the next step. She grabbed the phone, her fingers swiftly sliding over the screen, making the call that would turn everything into a bigger nightmare for them. She wasn't calling the police. Lisa knew that the truth, and only the truth, was what she needed now. The phone rang several times before someone picked up. "It's done," she said, her voice cold. "They know you're coming. They're ready." On the other end of the line, a deep voice responded, emotionless. "It's all set. Stay where you are." Lisa hung up, slipping the phone back into her pocket. She had made the connection. Now there was no turning back. She was ready to do whatever was necessary to reveal everything. Meanwhile, inside the house, David and Jake were immersed in a disturbing silence. What would happen next was no longer a matter of choice. They had lost control, and what was approaching them could no longer be avoided. David sat down, his hands trembling, his mind spinning. The murder, the lies, the manipulations. It was all now part of a story that was about to be told, and the ending was something he could never have predicted. There was no more space for lies. Everything was about to be revealed in a brutal, unforgiving way, and the worst part? Neither of them would be able to stop it. The arrival of the truth was inevitable. They were no longer in control. That night felt suspended in absolute suspense, as if time had stretched out to the point of breaking. David could feel the weight of the impending storm, but he was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Every breath he took seemed heavier, and the silence around Jake, as if both were waiting for something they couldn't avoid, made everything even more suffocating. Jake was visibly in shock, his hands on the table, his eyes empty, as if he were watching his life fall apart right before him. Lisa hadn't left, as they had expected. She had a strength neither of them could comprehend. It wasn't just revenge. It was an unstoppable force coming from a deep pain, from a desire to see everything shattered. Every move she made seemed intentional, precise, calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that terrified David. The tension in the house was like a rope about to snap. Every second that passed was one more second of uncertainty, one more chance for something worse to happen. The sound of Lisa's footsteps echoed in his mind. Even though she was no longer in the room, she was controlling everything now, and the truth she held was beginning to seem more powerful than any lie they had spun. "David, you need to understand," Jake murmured, his voice rough, barely audible. "The truth is never going to come out the way we think. Do you really think this is going to end well? It won't." David looked at him with an empty expression. He knew exactly what Jake was trying to say. They had been playing with fire for so long that now the fire was about to consume everything. But there was something inside David, a strength that made him keep trying, even though he knew the way out was closed. He couldn't give up now. He couldn't be defeated so easily. "We can't hide any more, Jake," David finally said, his voice full of bitterness. "The lie has already destroyed us. There's no going back." Jake seemed to want to say something, but stopped. He looked at his hands, his trembling fingers, as if the words had gotten lost before leaving his mouth. Lisa already knew too much. She had enough pieces to destroy both of them, to take control of the narrative and make them pay. The only thing they could do now was wait. Then the silence returned, and it was the kind of silence that precedes the worst of storms. David could feel the pressure tightening around his chest, as if he were trapped in a snare, knowing there was no room to maneuver any more. The truth was about to emerge, and there was no turning back. A few hours passed, and Jake's house was immersed in darkness as if it were being swallowed whole. The sound of rain tapping against the windows seemed to bring a sense of despair that spread through the halls. The two men sat in the living room in a state of suspension, each dealing with their own anguish and uncertainty. But the clock didn't stop. Time was running out. That was when David's phone rang again. An unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, as if deep down he knew that the answer to this phone call would change everything. When he finally picked up, Lisa's unmistakable voice came through. "David," Lisa's voice sounded firm and cold. "I know everything. No matter what you try to do now, it's already done. You know you can't escape anymore." David felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. He didn't want to hear it, but at the same time, he knew it was the only way to understand what was coming next. "Lisa, what do you want from us?" he asked, his voice trembling, feeling the weight of each word. "We're past the point of no return." She laughed, a cold laugh with no humor. "What do I want? I want the truth, David, the whole truth. Because that's what's going to destroy you too. Not the lies, not what you tried to hide. The truth will set me free, and it's going to destroy everything you've built." David closed his eyes for a moment, feeling crushed by the reality of what was about to happen. Lisa had taken control. There was no more room for false promises or clever moves. They were in the middle of a storm now, and the only thing left was to be swept away by the fury of revelation. That conversation was short, but enough to make David realize that Lisa wasn't playing anymore. She had chosen her side, and the battle was already decided. There was no way to escape the truth. The call ended, and with it any remaining shred of doubt disappeared. The night dragged on as David and Jake sat in silence, knowing there was nothing they could do any more. The truth was about to be exposed, and as the rain continued to fall outside, the two men knew that what came next wouldn't just be the consequence of the lies they had lived. It would be the end of everything they had planned. David no longer knew what to think. The phone call had ended, but Lisa's conversation still echoed in his mind. Her words carried the weight of a verdict, the sentence of something inevitable. There was no more room for disguises. There was no way to escape what was about to happen. It felt as though he was slowly sinking into an abyss, unsure of where it would end, but certain that the fall would be brutal. Jake, for his part, was completely silent. The man who had once seemed so firm, so ready to act, now appeared a shadow of what he had been. He was no longer speaking, no longer trying to control the situation. He was lost in his own thoughts, spiraling into a despair that consumed him. David felt a pang of compassion, but quickly pushed it away. He knew compassion no longer had a place here. Nothing had. Lisa hadn't surprised them. She had always been more perceptive than they had realized. David knew she harbored her own secrets, her own monsters, and somehow it now seemed that everyone's monsters were coming out to play. The lie they had built was like a house of cards, and every move, every revelation, caused the cards to fall, one after the other. But what frightened him the most was that, deep down, David knew there was something bigger, something darker that Lisa had prepared. She hadn't shown all her cards yet. There was more. It was at that moment that the door to the room opened, and Lisa walked in. She was different now, more controlled, with cold eyes as if she had finally freed herself from all the chains that had bound her. She wasn't anxious anymore. She wasn't trying to hide anything. She appeared calm, as though she had finally gained complete control of the situation. "You know what's going to happen, don't you, David?" Lisa asked, her voice calm but carrying something that David couldn't identify. It was as if she were speaking about something inevitable, as though she had accepted her fate. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm not doing this to destroy you. I'm doing this to free myself." David felt a chill down his spine. He knew what she meant, but he didn't want to believe it. He looked at Jake, who still hadn't moved, then turned his attention back to Lisa. She was waiting for something he couldn't give. An answer. "Free yourself from what, Lisa?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, even though he knew he was losing control. She smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a mixture of anger and resignation. "Free myself from what you did to me, from what this lie did to my life. You think you know, but you don't. You don't know what it's like to live with the weight of a lie. You don't know what it's like to be constantly deceived, to be treated like you're invisible. Now I see everything clearly, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to ensure this truth is revealed. Not just for you, but for me too." David wanted to scream, wanted to say she was doing this out of pure vengeance, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. He knew Lisa had surpassed everything he and Jake had done. She was beyond retaliation. She wasn't acting out of rage. She was acting out of a deep desire for justice, a desire for power, and for her there were no limits left. "You have no choice, David," she continued, her voice still calm but with a hardness David couldn't ignore. "The truth will come out. Everyone will know what happened. Everyone will see you for what you truly are, and it won't matter anymore how much you try to hide or deny." David looked at Jake, who finally raised his eyes. There were no more words between them, nothing more to be said. All that was left was to face the consequences of what they had done. Lisa was no longer the woman they knew. She had become something much bigger, something they had helped create, but that was now beyond their control. She turned to leave, but before stepping out the door, she paused for a moment. "You're going to pay. Not because I want you to, but because it's what life demands. The game you started is already out of control, and now all that's left is to wait for the outcome." She left the room without another word, leaving the two men there, alone with their shadows and the certainty that what was coming would be far worse than anything they had ever faced. The silence returned to the place once more, but now it was heavier than ever. They knew time was running out. David looked at Jake, his eyes empty, and felt a deep sadness. They had lost, but not just the game. They had lost the very essence of who they were. The lie had consumed them in a way they could no longer escape. And now the price of everything they had done was about to be paid in a way neither of them could have foreseen. What remained now was to wait. The outcome was approaching. The night, which had once seemed endless, now dragged on like an endless nightmare. The weight of what was to come seemed to intensify with every passing minute. The clock in the corner of the room continued to mark time with its unyielding precision, as if mocking them, reminding them that no matter how much they tried to hide, the future was there, waiting to swallow them. David was nearly out of strength, feeling as though every beat of his heart was a reminder that he was reaching the end of his journey. He knew there was no turning back. Jake was quiet, too quiet. There was no more anger in his eyes, no more despair. There was acceptance. The man whose spirit had once been filled with plans and ambitions now seemed like a specter. The soul that had once been vibrant was now empty. David knew Jake was preparing to face the worst, and then it happened. The door to the house opened, and in a sudden movement, almost as if choreographed, Lisa walked in. But she wasn't alone. At her side, a tall man with a stern expression, wearing a dark suit, stood like a shadow, present without making a sound. He didn't say a word, but his cold gaze said everything. He was the last piece of the puzzle, the one David hadn't realized was missing. Lisa looked at them with a chilling calm. "The game is over," she said, her words final, like a sentence. David couldn't speak. Fear, that deep fear, paralyzed him. He could feel that the truth that was about to be revealed would be far more devastating than any lie they had ever told. What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice broken, a question with no real hope for an answer. "I warned you," Lisa said with an enigmatic smile before turning to the man beside her. "Tell them what we need to do now." The man in the suit, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. His voice was deep, his tone impersonal. "You remember our conversation, don't you, Lisa?" He paused, as if waiting for a response, but no one said anything. "Now it's time to end this." David looked at Lisa, his eyes full of confusion. But instead of answering, she simply gestured with her hand, as if giving the man permission to proceed. He then stepped up to the table and, with a swift movement, handed David a thick envelope, sealed with red wax. The seal was imposing, like something from a world David didn't understand. "Inside this envelope is the final part of the truth," the man said, his voice cold and cutting. "There's nothing more you can do. The choice is now yours." David felt a growing pressure in his head, the sensation that something big was about to happen. The envelope was in his hands, but he hesitated. He knew that opening it would change everything. What was inside could be the end of it all. But at the same time, he knew he had no choice. With a trembling hand, he broke the seal and opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. It wasn't a lengthy document, but its words were enough to stop the heart of anyone who read them. "They know everything," it said. "Who knows everything?" David murmured, but before he could fully understand, Lisa stepped forward, the others, the more powerful ones. "What you did to control me, what you did to destroy my possibilities, wasn't just a mistake. It was a contract. And now that contract is being honored." David didn't understand immediately, but what Lisa was saying began to make sense. They weren't dealing with simple revenge anymore. They weren't facing the consequences of personal betrayal. They were dealing with something much bigger, something that extended beyond their own lives, beyond what they could comprehend. The man in the suit looked at them, as if watching their reactions. "You knew this was coming. You knew you were playing with fire. Now the fire is spreading. The contract is in effect, and you have two options: fulfill it or face the consequences." David and Jake exchanged a look of dread. Whatever this contract was, they were now completely at the mercy of forces they hadn't even imagined. Lisa stepped closer to them, now with unwavering confidence. She looked at them both with a cold smile and said, "You won't escape anymore. All of our fates have been sealed. There's nowhere to run." The door was slammed shut with a bang, and the sound echoed through the house, marking the end of the before and after. David felt a wave of hopelessness, but also a strange sense of relief. He knew that in some way there was something beyond this, something he hadn't understood until that moment. What had started as a web of lies and manipulations was now beyond their control. Lisa, who had once seemed like a fragile piece on the board, had become the player who controlled all the pieces. And David and Jake were about to pay the price. The game was over, and they could no longer run. And when the last breath of tension was exhaled, the silence that remained was definitive. The end didn't come as expected. It wasn't the fall. It wasn't the despair. It was the acceptance of the inevitable. And when it was all over, what remained was only a shadow of what had once been. The silence that followed was heavy, denser than anything that had happened before. David was immersed in a whirlwind of thoughts, a confusion that consumed him from the inside. He felt a knot in his stomach, as if his life had been reduced to a single moment, a single decision. He knew that somehow the choice was no longer his. Fate was beyond his reach, farther than any possibility of redemption he could imagine. Jake, on the other hand, was still in a state of shock. He seemed to look at Lisa and the man in the suit, but his eyes were vacant, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. The weight of the truth, the true extent of the contract Lisa had mentioned, was too much for him. He didn't know if fear had paralyzed him or if, finally, he had been defeated by everything they had done. Lisa turned around, a slight smile on her lips, a smile of victory. She knew the game was practically won. They were now at her mercy. The man beside her, still immersed in an impassive silence, seemed to be waiting for the next move. But what was left, after all, were only the final fragments of what had once been a life full of choices. Now every breath they took was a reminder of what they had lost. "You never imagined you would go this far, did you?" Lisa said, breaking the silence, but her voice didn't sound triumphant. There was a tone of bitterness, of a deep understanding that, in a way, she had already accepted everything that was to come. David couldn't speak any more. The weight of his actions, the confusion of his own morality, had become unbearable. He had no words left. There were no more excuses. Everything had collapsed in a way he hadn't foreseen. And deep in his mind, he knew. There was no turning back, no more hiding. "I've already done my part," Lisa continued. "Now what's left is to see how you'll pay the price. Not for the pain you caused, but for the truth you tried to hide. And that's what will destroy you. Not the murder, not the lies, but the truth." Her last sentence reverberated in David's mind, like a sentinel, an uncomfortable truth he had tried to ignore. It was the price for the illusion of control. For attempting to manipulate life, the nature of things. The truth, as always, would eventually come to light. They could no longer fight against it. "The game isn't over yet," the man in the suit suddenly spoke, breaking the silence again. He was speaking calmly, as though he weren't dealing with human lives, but with pieces on a board. "The choice now is yours. The consequences are inevitable." David and Jake exchanged a look of dread. Whatever this contract was, they were now completely at the mercy of forces they hadn't even imagined. Lisa stepped closer to them, now with unwavering confidence. She looked at both of them with a cold smile and said, "You underestimated me," she said, "and now you'll finally understand what it means to underestimate someone." David and Jake exchanged empty glances, powerless to protest, hopeless for redemption. They knew that what came next wouldn't be about choice or running away anymore. It was the conclusion of something much bigger than they had imagined. They had played with fate, and now it was fate that would swallow them. And when the last breath of tension was exhaled, the silence that remained was definitive. The end didn't come as expected. It wasn't the fall. It wasn't the despair. It was the acceptance of the inevitable. And when it was all over, what remained was only a shadow of what had once been. The truth had triumphed, and with it the definitive silence. The end.